Sunday, April 24, 2022. Welcome to the 11th episode in this series from MeidasTouch and 5-minute news called The Weekend Show. Download the show as audio in addition to my daily 5-minute news podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Anthony Davis, and joining me today is election integrity advocate and political writer Jennifer Cohn. Hi, Jennifer. Nice to see you.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, pretty good. Thank you very much. Now, this week there are kind of three characters that I want to focus on. Three kind of brazen Republicans. You might call them, Donald Trump's henchmen. There's Ron DeSantis to talk about. There's Kevin McCarthy to talk about. And then there's also Mark Meadows, who it turns out is registered to vote in 3 states whilst demanding election integrity. Kevin McCarthy has, it's been revealed that the House leader held Donald Trump responsible for the immediate aftermath of the January 6th Capitol riot, and that Trump himself accepted some responsibility for the insurrection. And McCarthy, when this was announced by the New York Times, McCarthy put out a statement saying, "I never said that." And then 10 minutes later, they put out the audio of him saying it on tape, which was rather brilliant. And then finally, and maybe we should start with this, Florida, an awful lot has been happening in Florida. Massive fights with Disney World and, LGBTQ plus laws, maths textbooks that supposedly have CRT in them. But specifically, I want to talk about Ron DeSantis brazenly trying to curtail black political power in his state as he redraws its congressional districts to significantly benefit Republicans. There's currently 4 districts in the state where black voters can elect their preferred candidates. His plan leaves just 2, and his map chops up the 5th district into 4 new districts where black voters would comprise of a much smaller share of the population. So your experiences in election integrity and as your poster behind you kind of explains, we have to protect our votes.
That's right.
But this is slightly different to that, isn't it? I mean, this is before we even get to the ballot box, they're effectively trying to rig the election.
Well, that's right. That's what partisan gerrymandering is. It is rigging elections. And yes, that is what they're trying to do. I think Florida in particular has a lot of areas of concern when it comes to election integrity. And that is in itself extremely concerning because, of course, Ron DeSantis may very well run for president in 2024, and he's already inflicting quite a bit of damage as the governor of Florida right now.
Is it the case that, because I've heard about, some of DeSantis's people knocking on doors, asking older people in many cases, and there's a lot of elderly people living in Florida, about their vote and their voter registration and changing their voter registration, changing parties from Democrat to Republican. So even before the gerrymandering, there's also it seems to be a very planned kind of ideal to create this Republican superstate. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that process as well?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. So I saw in the news probably about a month ago, reports about voter registrations in Florida being switched from Democrat to Republican without the voters' consent. And it got a fair amount of coverage, but I came out of my sort of hiding on doing videos. I haven't done any in a while because I felt like that could use a national boost in terms of attention. And so I interviewed State Senator Annette Taddeo, who, by the way, is running for governor in Florida. And she's sort of spearheading the investigation into this issue. There was a really good on-the-ground reporter, and I'm sorry to say I don't remember her name off the top of my head, but Senator Taddeo said that in at least 3 counties, they have found voter registrations having been switched without voters' consent. And the good news is it's the kind of thing that actually can be investigated fairly easily because you can get a list and find out who has switched their voter registrations and then literally go ask those voters if they meant to have them switched. But they're finding more and more, and the more attention the issue gets, the more people are contacting her office saying that it happened to them. And it really illustrates, I think, the important role that the media plays in amplifying these concerns. Even when there's not sort of an immediate remedy, people need to know that their voter registration may have been changed in order to in order to know the importance of checking their registration. And I do have a question as to whether this could have affected the maps. I actually don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that when they draw the maps, they do take into account the number of registered Republicans versus registered Democrats. And in Florida, for the first time, the Republicans are all boasting that suddenly Republicans have they've surpassed the Democrats in terms of registrations. And now we're finding that it may not be on the up and up. Tadeo told me she thought there were thousands and thousands that had been switched without consent, but it's still being investigated.
And how does that work? I mean, that's somebody knocking on a door and asking somebody specifically about who they're voting for, or because I think it's a little bit like cold callers, isn't it? Trying to sell you insurance. You know, the language that they use is designed to give them license to switch the vote. Is that right?
Well, what she told me that they were doing is they would show, in this one building, especially in particular, which I think was in Miami-Dade, it was a building for elderly, with a lot of elderly tenants, a lot of them who don't even speak English as a first language, many of them Hispanic. And they would show up and say that they were there to update voter registrations. And you don't need to update your voter registration, although I suppose if you want to update your signature because you think your signature is old, you could do that for legitimate reasons. But what they would do is they'd present them with like a clipboard and keep their hand. There's a whistleblower, by the way. So she knows this because there was a whistleblower. She said that they were trained to put their hand over part of the form where they would be updating their registration, the part which said what political party they were registered for. And then they were instructed to just write in Republican after. And so it's really not a matter of whether this has happened. It's a matter of scope. And whether, and I think why too, because that isn't the same thing as changing people's votes, but it certainly creates a perception that may be untrue that Republicans are really dominating the state. And then that can, for example, possibly affect the maps. I don't know about that for sure, but certainly it affects public perception and how much money people are going to be willing to pour into the state on the Democratic side. If they think the Republicans have it all locked up, they may not put as many boots on the ground, and they may direct their funding for candidates elsewhere. And it's a really big deal. And it can also mask vote flipping. If hypothetically someone wanted to flip votes, say from Democrat to Republican, it's a lot easier to get away with that if you have more registered Republicans than registered Democrats. And then one last thing, I know it's sort of a mouthful, they could even use it in the reverse scenario, where if Democrats win, they could scream fraud based on having more Republican registered voters than Democrats. Say, how can this possibly be a legitimate result? So it's very concerning.
And this is the irony, is that the only people that were screaming fraud throughout this whole election were Republicans. And
right.
Yet Republicans are the ones committing fraud. And that's,
I imagine
that's really the irony of this, isn't it?
It's very ironic. Sort of the larger frauds that we're seeing seem to be Republicans. I don't want to suggest that there is no such thing as election fraud or voter fraud. Those are two separate things, by the way. Voter fraud is typically fraud committed by individual voters, and that's really where you have sort of this myth on the right side of the political spectrum that it's a massive problem. It does occur. It absolutely does occur. But the notion that it's a massive problem is where the myth comes in. And oftentimes you'll see Republicans putting up a straw man argument when one person gets arrested saying, see, they say there's no voter fraud, but look, there's this one person. And I don't think anyone who studies this issue or is an advocate for the integrity of our elections says that there's no voter fraud. That's just not true. There absolutely is. Yes, both parties do it, but it certainly seems like there have been more instances lately of Republicans doing it. The scheme in Florida would really be more of an example of election fraud because it's election insiders, not the individual voters, committing fraud. And the same would be true if someone were to rig the voter registration machines or the voting machines themselves. Those would be examples of election fraud. So yeah, in this case, certainly it's the Republicans.
Let's just look at this map specifically. I mean, for those people that don't quite understand, the map in the first place in Florida is drawn to basically support a large area that is dominated by black voters or black citizens who vote. and it's designed to enable them to have access to kind of equal representation. The fear is that if they get a Republican supposedly looking after them, then certainly in the case of Florida, they're going to be a white Christian nationalist. And then they're not going to look out, give them the kind of representation that they deserve. But this has been eliminated now. I mean, so really Ron DeSantis' argument is that the original drawing of this map was racist because it was effectively racist against white people, is what he's saying. It created a kind of a ghettoized black space. And he's saying, I am not racist because I am undoing that. So he's basically using language that gives the impression that he's the savior because he's getting racism out of Florida, when in fact, to those people who are now underrepresented, it's the opposite, right?
Everything, it seems like, with the GOP these days is opposite day. If they say integrity, that probably means fraud. If they say fraud, it probably means a clean election. If they say, something is racist, it's probably the opposite. If they say it isn't racist, it probably is. So yes, it is the opposite, and it's very concerning. And just on the issue of integrity of elections, I mean, Ron DeSantis's own win against Andrew Gillum was arguably tainted in the sense that in the run-up to that election, you had Senator Bill Nelson, who was running in the Senate race against Rick Scott, sort of blowing the whistle on something that the Senate Intelligence Committee knew but hadn't been announced publicly, which is that the Russians had actually breached Florida voter registration systems. According to Senator Nelson, they had persistent access, which what happened is during the election, the FBI wouldn't comment on Nelson's remarks. I think everyone made it seem like he was crazy to be bringing this up. Surely we would know if this was the case. Well, guess what? It was the case, but we didn't find out about it until after the election. And I don't know that we would have found out about it at all were it not for Bob Mueller finally putting it in his report. And then he gave a briefing to, I guess, then Governor, now it was Governor DeSantis. But what's never been addressed is the persistent access. And I imagine they probably did have persistent access, whether to the voter registration systems, because that's kind of what a hacker would want to do. And that doesn't mean they used it, but it's very concerning. And I have a grave concern that we don't have transparency about problems when they actually do occur. And we have one political party that says definitively that fraud occurred when they don't have proof of it, and it appears that there wasn't any. And then we have the other party, which is my party, the Democrats, not wanting to undermine the public's confidence in elections, so sort of a lofty goal, but denying that there is cause for concern about their own losses when there is cause for concern about their own losses. And it really, Florida is really one of the top examples of this. So that you add the gerrymandering in, and then you've got, we've got these breached voter registration systems. We have a lack of transparency. There was a senator from Florida, or actually Representative Stephanie Murphy, who is just a real superstar. And she was one of the people from Florida who was really pushing for more transparency about what happened in 2016. And guess what? She became a target by Trump's behind-the-scenes longtime advisor, Roger Stone, and his cabal. Stone has a longtime associate or assistant named Jacob Ingalls, who's a propagandist in the state of Florida particularly, and he was relentless against her. And she finally announced that because she has kids, she's not going to seek a second term. She had tears in her eyes, and he took credit for it on his social media. He said that, he's the one who ran her out. And so, there's lots of election integrity concerns in the state of Florida, and these concerns are really lie at the hands of the Republicans there.
Initially in Florida, a judge refused to accept this map. It was DeSantis decided to draw his own map. Normally the governor doesn't touch the map; the legislature draws the map, right? But he drew his own map, submitted it. Then there was a lawsuit. The judge said, you can't draw your own map. You're the governor, and this map is not a suitable map. And then a week later, the judge says, actually, you're okay. It's fine. And then, so DeSantis effectively overrides the judiciary and is like, I'm the governor. And so now we've got the governor's own map. I mean, this is the thing I don't quite understand, is that how is it, everything obviously has there's always a legal ramification with all of these things. And there's so many court cases going on as we speak regarding gerrymandering and boundary lines being redrawn. But in this case, the governor of Florida overrided the decision of a judge. And now the legislature has approved the Florida has effectively approved this map, and DeSantis now is signing this map into law. I mean, this has all happened in the last 3 days, and hence the protests. I mean, this seems so unlawful, and it's being done in plain sight. The coup effectively in plain sight. How is it the case that a governor can override the decision of a judge in this way?
Legally, he shouldn't be able to override it. You mentioned that the judge had said, okay, actually, you're right, go ahead. I wasn't aware that the judge had done that. I mean, that is very concerning and probably cause for an investigation. But what happens is you reach a tipping point in some of these states where enough of the institutions are corrupted. He appoints judges. DeSantis himself appoints judges. Right. He also puts people on, he has some election integrity commission, that he's probably corrupted, and the state AG. And at a certain point, there isn't anyone, it's the fox guarding the hen house. And that may just be where we are. But I think that in the past, politicians, maybe even from both parties, had some degree of shame. And when you're truly shameless, you just do what you want and they're running out the clock. They're just going to do it. And I believe this is an attempt to run out the clock. I know that there is the NAACP, and I think the League of Women Voters and maybe Common Cause are challenging this in court. And I hope they succeed. I hope they succeed before the midterm election.
DeSantis, I think it was a lawyer from his office, said lawmakers had considered race too much when they drew the original map, violating the U.S. Constitution. He also said the district was not black enough, saying that the reduced share of black voters would make it harder for them to elect the candidate of their choice, violating anti-gerrymandering language in the Florida Constitution. It's like, well, which is it? Is it a black district or is it not a black district? They said. I mean,
well, their arguments don't make they're not internally consistent. And that's also, that is just a degree of shamelessness.
And this issue of shame is something that seems to come up a lot in these types of conversations. Shame is actually a really important element to police any kind of democracy, isn't it? Because you have to have a moral compass, and the moral compass is connected to a sense of shame, doing something that is so illegal or publicly illegal. It's a little bit like let me just give you another example. There's a very another one of Ron DeSantis's henchmen. I think his name is, let's have a look here. His name is Randy Fine. He's a Florida representative. He had some choice words for his enemies. He said Democrats who oppose restrictions on classroom discussions of gender identity for young children are perverts and groomers. School board members who support mask mandates are child abusers who deserve a special place in hell. And he said a similar thing for people who didn't trust these, the redistricting. I mean, all of these characters, it's not like it's just the guy at the top. It's all of the surrogates and all of the henchmen, as I described them. They all seem to lack shame, don't they? And so what hope is there for democracy going forward if this vital element is missing?
Well, I'm very concerned about how much hope we have for democracy, but we have to try. I think there are many elements to what is happening, but certainly this is an information war, and it's a war for sort of the hearts and minds. And the right wing really took over right wing radio, and they got a huge jump start on social media, not necessarily in legitimate ways. I saw something where it was like Trump had 4 times as many bots as Hillary did in 2016, but they really got a jump start with this artificial amplification on social media. And it is very coordinated. I don't think that necessarily the public appreciates the extent to which it's coordinated. So like this whole groomers thing, I don't know for sure that it started with Roger Stone, but I think it may very well have started with Roger Stone, who, by the way, lives in the state of Florida. He has long used false accusations of pedophilia against political opponents. He did that to a journalist named Bob Norman. There was a long article about it. And it was his... Jack Posobiec is sort of the king of fake news on Twitter. And that is he is a Roger Stone protege. He worked with him very closely in 2016 and after, and he's been huge. And, he'll start something sometimes with like a hashtag. So he really went viral on Twitter with the groomers hashtag and using it against Disney, for example. And then someone fortunately did, and he got Twitter banned temporarily over that, but then they're just masters at creating fake outrage. But you see it going from him to maybe Fox News to maybe the lawmakers. And it's this sort of well-oiled outrage machine. So some of it is false information and a lot of it is fabricated outrage because.
And then it's repeated by the followers though, isn't it?
Calling people groomers because they want to stand up for or scapegoat children who are different than other children who are already sort of among the most vulnerable in our societies is about as reprehensible as it can get. And yet that is what they choose to do because it seems to rile up their base and it dominates the airwaves. And they've got it's very difficult to shame people when they've got their own sort of closed networks.
And creating a false narrative that they are just seeking to protect people or give people their freedom back or protect elections when the reality is they're rigging them in the process of protecting them.
Right. And I think to an extent, they're trying to outlaw shame. That's sort of where they don't want to teach the history of racism in the country. And they didn't want on this gerrymandering bill, they didn't want the Democrats to be able to even mention on the floor the history of racism in the country and in the state of Florida, because that would be implying, that the current lawmakers are maybe racist. And that's impolite to do. And that's just, it's outrageous. They're essentially trying to outlaw shame when they're outlawing the lessons of history. And it's extremely dangerous.
And I suppose the Disney World issue is an example of this, where the punishment does not fit the crime. The crime is that Disney is siding with LGBTQ plus people. The son of the Disney boss is trans, or the child, I should say, of the Disney boss is trans, and this has wound up Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, that they are, supporting this community in their workers and the like. And so instead of just like putting out a statement saying that, we do not believe in this and this is not our view, he's effectively taking away the entire governing license for Disney World in Florida. That's quite an extreme response, isn't it?
It absolutely is. They're the ones who wanted corporations, to have a right to speech, right? And they're infringing, they're attacking Disney for its free speech. I hope that Disney stands its ground, and I hope they leave the state. That would serve Ron DeSantis right. Although actually I don't want to punish the citizens of Florida. All right, maybe not. I'd have to think it through more. But certainly DeSantis would deserve it if Disney were to pull up stakes and go somewhere else. The citizens of Florida, that is something else. They're not to blame for their governor.
But that's not practical, is it? Disney leaving Florida is just not practical. The cost implications of that are insane.
Probably not.
Right. So the reality here is that there's going to have to be some kind of truce, and that will probably come after a multitude of court cases. But if the judges in Florida are Trump appointed, as is the case with this redistricting with this map, then what chance does Disney stand?
I don't know. They don't want to set a bad precedent on these issues. Can go both ways, and so even if they are sort of right-wing judges, they may hesitate to do anything that, undermines the right of free speech. But I don't know. Sometimes the judges do better than you expect, even when they were put on there deliberately. So we have to hope that that's the case. But certainly, I think Disney should sue for defamation. Absolutely. And again, this Jack Posobiec, who is dominant, he has 1.5 million followers on Twitter, and he has a long history of making stuff up. And he was really leading the charge of calling Disney a bunch of groomers. And he also spread the Pizzagate lie right after the 2016 election, that Hillary had a pedophile ring in a pizza parlor. And soon after, there was a shooting at the pizza parlor. No one was hurt.
Yeah, I was going to say that poor pizza parlor. It's been raided so many times by people wanting to find out. These are QAnon people, of course, trying to find out, what's going on in the basement. Well, what's going on in the basement is dough is being needed.
They didn't even have a basement, I believe. There was no basement, but yes,
right,
exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing with this groomers, he actually was at Disneyland just the preceding month, after Disney had come out, and after there was already a controversy between Disney and DeSantis. So it's a manufactured outrage, and that is what they specialize in. There's what the Democrats are up against. It is partly the dominionists, because nothing really motivates people like good, religious fanaticism. And the religious fanatics, for the most part, are on the right. And so it's not the RNC really that has established sort of this misinformation network. It is largely the dominionists, with help from people like Roger Stone, who's now pretending to be a dominionist, even though I don't believe he is. But the Leadership Institute, the Council for National Policy is sort of the umbrella organization for all of these groups. And under it, you have ALEC. And then you also have this thing called the Leadership Institute, run by a guy named Morton Blackwell, who's just trained, I don't know, thousands of Republican operatives that moral outrage is the number one motivating force in politics. And they are more than happy to fabricate it. And that's what they've done for years. But I do think that with the Twitter presidency being Trump, it really exploded, and to a point where I hope we haven't crossed a tipping point where we can't rein it back in, but people are catching on. You hear that more and more. The culture wars is sort of a manufactured outrage, but yeah, there's this having things go viral on social media has really upped the ante.
Well, they know what they're doing, don't they? We've seen this with several politicians who like to check their own Twitter after they've said something outrageous to see the effect of it. And when I spoke with Jared Sexton on this show a few weeks ago, he was talking a lot about these think tanks that operate at very high levels. But these are organizations and groups that we never know about. They are put in there. They are paid for by high office, on the right, and they are coming up with these plans. They are making these kind of cunning plans to overturn the election or to rig the election or to get misinformation out there. This is not happening by accident. This is really a very thoughtful process. This is part of a much bigger plan, isn't it? It's almost a conspiracy theory in itself to think that there is a conspiracy.
It's coordinated, certainly. So, for example, you had Ollie Alexander, who was the sort of social media provocateur, longtime operative, working with Roger Stone very carefully on 3 Stop the Steal operations. There was one in 2016, I don't know if you worked on that one, Ollie, but Stone did, 2018, and then with the midterms, and then 2020. And so he has connection. I mean, Roger Stone is a lot more powerful than people realize, but perhaps in particular, he has the strong connections to the Proud Boys, and maybe to a slightly lesser extent, but still there, the Oath Keepers, and Alex Jones, who in his, I don't know if he's taken a hit or not, but certainly at 2016, he had millions and millions and millions.
Well, he's just filed for bankruptcy,
right, because of the Sandy Hook,
because of the cost of
but I don't know how his show
the Sandy Hook families.
Right. So he had access. There were a lot of disaffected, angry voters, I guess, who listened to Alex Jones, and Trump really, I think, organized them sort of Stone, to an extent, Trump too, but Stone in particular worked with Alex Jones to really motivate this group. So you have Ollie Alexander being this connector between that world, the Roger Stone, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Alex Jones world. And then he's also a member of the Council for National Policy, which I don't think enough people realize that there is a structure to a lot of these think tanks, with the Council for National Policy really being the top dog. And it is very much an umbrella. So you've got the leaders of ALEC and of the Federalist Society and probably the Claremont Institute. They're all members of the Council for National Policy, and they've been around since the 80s. And their vision for the country is very much dominionist. They want to get rid of or completely change the concept of public education and have Jesus taught in schools. And they want to eliminate, it's very libertarian as well. They want to eliminate pretty much all federal agencies, so you saw like DeVos, that you get the opposite today. That was what Trump was doing. He was kissing up to the Council for National Policy with putting all the people in the federal agencies to destroy them. And they hate trans kids. They, in the name of Jesus Christ, they want to scapegoat them. And they're obviously against a woman's right to choose. And it's all very depressing. And I remember when I first read about them, and I first learned about them on Twitter, actually, the Council for National Policy, the Southern Poverty Law Center had done a big piece on them. But it sounded so far-fetched just 6 years ago. I guess that was, 2017 is 5 years ago. And now everyone talks about the Dominionists. It's not far-fetched. That's exactly what's happening. And it's becoming normalized to an extent, which is really scary.
There was a video released in the last week of Roger Stone arriving at Mar-a-Lago, and you see Trump turn around and go, "Roger, I didn't see you there," and shakes his hand, and Roger whispers, but it's picked up on the video, saying something very derogatory about Governor Ron DeSantis. And I found that really interesting, because you kind of assume that all Republicans are on the same team. So clearly there is rivalry, and maybe from Stone's perspective, because I do see Stone still as the puppet master,
yes,
that really DeSantis is a bit of a distraction, because he is registered in Florida, as is Trump registered in Florida. They can't both run for president, can they?
Well, even if he remains as governor, that's bad enough. But that's right. What I think Stone helped get Ron DeSantis elected. So Matt Gaetz, also Florida, also, reprehensible, apparently under federal investigation for sex trafficking of a minor. He is very close, or was at least very close, with Roger Stone. And he was the head of Ron DeSantis's transition team, and that can't be an accident. So I think that Stone, he's sort of like a mafioso. He talks about loyalty, about, you need loyalty. And he's accusing DeSantis of being disloyal, because here the unspoken part is Roger Stone helped him get elected. And now he's threatening Roger Stone's top guy, which is Trump, and that's disloyal. He needs to stay in his place. He needs to remember who buttered his bread, who got him to where he was. I think that's what's going on there. And by the way, with the McCarthy thing, I was not surprised at all. And maybe most people weren't, by that tape that came out, because Stone has been attacking McCarthy, and he even has set out what his next coup attempt will be, which is to... he feels that Kevin McCarthy is an impediment to his plan to install Trump as Speaker of the House if the Republicans win the House in the midterm elections. That's his big plan. And then his plan actually goes further than that. They think they're going to be able to get Biden out on mental incompetence, and then they plan to impeach Kamala, which, even if they impeached her, they wouldn't have the votes, I don't think, to get her out, unless they have a complete rout. But that second part of the plan seems far-fetched. I'm not sure that it is far-fetched putting him in as Speaker of the House. I remember reading a while back.
He wouldn't want to do it, though, would he, Jennifer? I mean, that's my concern with Trump, is that he was always very lazy. He never presidented at all. He had this executive time 3 hours every day in the morning in his calendar, which was basically him watching TV, and we know that now because a lot of his tweets coincide with things that were said on cable news. But can you imagine Trump having the energy to be the Speaker of the House? I mean,
yes.
It's a tough job. He just wouldn't want to do it.
I imagine he would do it. I think he would do it, but I don't know, maybe not. Maybe if he thinks he's just going to win straight up in 2024, which, by the way, I mean, I mean, I am very disappointed. Just a very quick segue. I feel like the Democrats had a real opportunity, and this again is my political party, just to be upfront, but I feel like they had a real opportunity to pass a standalone election security bill. Because don't forget, the ones that were so concerned after 2016 were the Democrats, because the Russians attacked our election infrastructure, the degree to which the public is not allowed to know, apparently. But so the Democrats, after suddenly Trump flipped the script, I think quite cynically and without basis, flipped the script, but he scammed his voters into thinking that the election was stolen from him. So certainly there are plenty of Republican voters who would support an election security bill that at least required some of the basics, like meaningful manual audits for federal races. And the Democrats really should have done that, I feel, as a standalone bill. It would have been easy to message. It would give them sort of a rhetorical point if again in 2024 or 2022, I guess they can still try it for 2024, but if in 2022 the Republicans try to say that the election was fraudulent, they can point out that they tried to pass an election security bill. And this might actually be the one time where Republican lawmakers who voted against Ron Wyden's election security bill before the 2020 election, where they would be sufficiently shamed by their own voters into actually voting for it. And they didn't even try. And I have a hard time getting over that. I don't think I'll ever get over it.
But was it not tied up in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that they weren't able to pass? I mean, were these election security issues not part of those two bills?
It was tied up in one of the two. It wasn't the John Lewis one. It was the other one, For the People Act, I think. There were a couple of the big omnibus ones. But it didn't actually require audits until 2024, and then it required only one race. So 2022 was still left wide open, and I'm not sure we survive past 2022 if we get routed in 2022. But the point being, it was just a poor negotiating tactic to not come right back with some standalones on election security and other issues.
Time is an issue, isn't it? You know, the amount of time you leave between an event happening and doing something about it is a real issue. And Robert Reich wrote about this in The Guardian this week, saying that it's, time has passed. It's becoming too late to do anything about Donald Trump, overturning the election or attempting to overturn the election. Because people have short memories, and I think Republicans maybe take advantage of the fact that people have short memories. It certainly happened with Kevin McCarthy this week, denying that, he ever said anything about anything, and then of course the opposite being presented on an audio tape. So is time really a problem now? Is it too late?
Well, for 2022 on a standalone election security bill, I think it is too late. One of the main things also, they should have removed the wireless modems. That was one of the big talking points, that suddenly Republicans were shocked that some of the ballot scanners at the precincts in Florida, for example, in swing states have wireless modems. Well, guess what? Ron Wyden, myself, a lot of, legitimate election security advocates and experts were talking about this before the election, and the Republicans blocked their removal. It is too late to have that, I think, before 2022. So, but not for 2024. As far as, Trump trying to steal the election, I don't think it's ever too late to point that out. I still want everyone to know in more detail what happened in 2000 with Gore v. Bush, and even Roger Stone's involvement there with the Brooks Brothers riot, which was a manufactured riot to stop the counting, as the two candidates, Bush and Gore, Bush was still ahead, but it dwindled to less than 500 votes. Ultimately, he supposedly won by 537 votes in the state of Florida. We're back to the state of Florida. And, Roger Stone, that was his gig, was actually stopping the counting. And I think as Democrats, we have to be able to do both. We have to be able to talk about sort of the everyday issues that affect Americans, but we also have to be able to reckon with the wrongdoing of a rogue political party. And it's been rogue for a lot longer than people want to admit, but we are at this disadvantage because we don't have the religious crazies and we don't have as many billionaires. And even the billionaires we have don't care as much because they're billionaires. So we don't have the same, that Council for National Policy thing is a huge problem. We don't have an equivalent on the left, and because we don't have that fervor, we don't have the same degree of corruption. So there isn't the same motivation, I guess, until things really come collapse even more. Maybe there will be, but like with the thing that happened in Florida with the gerrymandering, to circle back, you really have this sense with the sit-in, it sat on the floor, that we're witnessing history, but not in the way we want to be witnessing history. It's the history repeating, going backwards. It's really, I don't think it's too late to message these things, but we don't have the apparatus in place.
Let's just talk for a moment about Marjory Taylor Greene. She's was on the stand on Friday.
Yep.
The controversial representative of Georgia. She faced a challenge to her re-election by voters and a supporting legal group who was seeking to knock her off the ballot for her role prior to the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. She was answering questions in Atlanta in a court there as part of her the candidacy challenge, which makes her the first Republican member of Congress to testify publicly under oath about the Capitol riot, even as a Democratic-led committee is spending months investigating the attack. A handful of voters in her district, represented by a non-profit called Free Speech for People, say that Greene should be disqualified because they allege she encouraged and supported the rioters who stormed the Capitol. I watched some of the testimony on Friday, and she seems to also have a very short memory. She doesn't remember saying anything, despite video evidence being shown to the contrary. She's a very dangerous character, isn't she? Because when we talk about shame, it is zero, isn't it? Zero shame, just saying anything out loud to kind of, rubbish the Democrats, and yet also very malicious and aggressive language towards minority groups and similar. So, I mean, surely there must be like 24 Republicans, who could be up in court on similar charges, no?
Yeah, I don't know what the reasoning was to start with her. She did say, there is sort of a really devastating quote where she said before the insurrection, you can't allow it to just transfer power peacefully like Joe Biden wants. So she's up on the stand claiming that she never called for violence, and she's all about peace, and that's just not true. She also said this is our 1776 moment, which is a reference, of course, to the American Revolution, and really has been a rallying cry of sort of the far right, meaning standing up, usually in armed conflict with the federal government. So, for example, in the Bundy standoff in 2014, that was the rancher Cliven Bundy, who owed $1 million for his occupation of federal grazing lands. And when the feds came out there was this big armed standoff. And this is really what put the Oath Keepers on the map, by the way, was with the Bundys. And 1776 was sort of that's what they called it. And InfoWars, Alex Jones, covered that conflict extensively. And Joe Biggs, who's one of the top indicted Proud Boys organizers, the right-hand man to Enrique Tarrio, who was the national chairman, he covered the Bundy standoff for Alex Jones back in the day, and that was 1776. So it's interesting when you do a search for all the people that were messaging 1776. It's kind of the top of the food chain, and what's nice about their lawsuit. I love Free Speech for People, by the way, is a really great organization, a really great nonprofit. What's nice about it is I assume that the burden of proof is more likely than not preponderance of the evidence, as opposed to the criminal burden of proof, which is really a lot of the problem I think that the DOJ has, which beyond a reasonable doubt is a very high burden of proof when you're talking about intent and that sort of thing. And so I'm hoping that helps them there. I'm very interested in some of the civil cases too, though, that have been filed and what the status is of those that have been filed by, like, the Capitol Police have sued the Proud Boys, and I hope Alex Jones, I'm not sure.
Well,
Proud
and
Boys
suing the
leaders.
former president as well,
and Trump. I'd be very interested in that. And I hope. The problem we have is our legal system is just so slow. It's like it can't keep up. And then once they put everyone, if it's that slow, then you get Trump back in office and he's just going to pardon.
Well, that was my concern about why Democrats hadn't been more forceful about passing any kind of voting rights, ahead of the infrastructure bill, which, of course, was the only thing they've managed to pass so far. Because you or even through executive order. I mean, Trump in the end couldn't get things through and just did everything by executive order. And Biden has done a lot of executive orders, but it just seems surprising to me that, election integrity and ensuring that the fundamental fabric of American democracy is maintained through the midterms and then into the next general election. It's so essential. And yet there's even just very little chatter about it from the Democrats. And my fear is that they're missing a trick here. Kamala Harris was put in charge of this. We hear nothing from the vice president.
She was put in charge of this? No, we hear nothing from her, and it's very, very odd. And I have to think it is a tactical decision of some sort, that they're going to roll her out pristine and no one's attacked her because she hasn't done anything. But you know what? No one's going to love her either because she hasn't done anything, or at least we don't hear about it if she is doing it. So I don't know what's going on with Kamala, but yes, I feel that they missed a beat. And I do not know what goes on behind closed doors, what tricks a president has up his sleeve to, get other Democrats in line to pass a bill. I mean, I suppose if somebody's just not going to do it, maybe they just won't do it. But it certainly had the feeling that Biden was not prioritizing voting rights. And I mean, honestly, we had young people on a hunger strike, and that didn't get enough coverage really either. We had young people starving themselves to try to get him to prioritize it. And then he's sort of like, okay, we're going to prioritize it now. But he wasn't going to, because I think he felt it was a lost cause and he wanted that he could maybe do infrastructure. And as it turned out, I don't think we got either one, right? Maybe we got a few. Yeah. So it's not a great record. You have to wonder what is going on with Kyrsten Sinema and,
Joe Manchin.
The coal baron guy, whose name is Manchin, escaping me. But were they bribed? Were they blackmailed? Or they just don't get it?
Well, they've been bought. I mean, people are now saying, using that
certainly.
language, they've been bought. Finally, I want to talk about Mark Meadows. He spent many of his final days as the former President Trump's chief of staff railing against election fraud, which he and other Republicans falsely claimed had tipped the election in favor of Biden. And after exiting the White House, he took a position as a senior partner at the Conservative Partnership Institute, the CPI, which promotes election integrity efforts. He gave a speech at their summit in Atlanta in February. And then just 3 weeks later, according to records obtained by the Washington Post, Meadows, his wife, submitted registrations to vote in North Carolina, all while being registered to vote in Virginia and South Carolina. The overlap lasted about 3 weeks, and it might have continued if revelations about his voting record had not attracted scrutiny in North Carolina. He's still registered in Virginia and South Carolina, so he is effectively registered to vote in 3 states. And yet, making noises about election integrity. I mean, shame, I guess, is another thing we've talked about. He will argue this was an oversight. Of course he will. But fundamentally, this is the former chief of staff who now is being implicated as the kind of nucleus for text messages on the, in the lead up and the aftermath of the 6th of January insurrection, getting texts from everyone, left, right, and center. I mean, his cell phone was probably, on fire that day, and is probably going to be the evidence that really kind of closes the deal on the insurrection, isn't it? But I mean, what future do we have? Does this guy have, considering that so much of this stuff has got his fingerprints all over it?
I mean, I don't know what kind of future he has. I think that what's happened. Did he actually vote twice? Has that been shown?
I don't know. It's just that the exposure is that he was registered to vote in 3 states.
Interesting. Well, certainly we have a very broken system. Whether it can be repaired remains to be seen, but we just have such disparate remedies given depending on who you are in this country for this type of, let's just say he voted in more than one place. Does anybody believe he's going to get 5 years like Crystal Mason got? No, nobody believes that. Even at the villages where they deliberately voted, that's in Florida, where you have people who deliberately voted twice, probably for Trump, but it's not 100%, but probably for Trump, and they got probation. But then there was another case recently where a woman didn't know that she wasn't qualified to register, and she registered anyway, and they're going to hit her. She's Black, of course, with something like 5 years also. And I don't know that we can recover from this level of corruption of our agencies. It's very, very concerning. I mean, we're on the knife's edge, and it just remains to be seen. I think with Mark Meadows registering more than one place, unfortunately, in the current climate, that is not going to do him in. If he voted in more than one,
but it's an example. It's an
Yeah.
example of the hypocrisy, isn't it? I guess that's really what this is, and so hypocrisy, like shame, which we keep coming back to, is clearly ancient history for Republicans. We like to talk about solutions on this show, so let's just spend the last couple of minutes just talking about where, with your expertise, where you feel changes need to be made, what Democrats can do whilst they're in office in this last remaining period before the midterms, potentially. Because, there's all these predictions of huge losses for Democrats. But actually, a lot of the statistics argue that they could, with a lot of the redistricting that's been going on, Democrats have actually found favor with some of the redistricting. And court cases have benefited Democrats in some districts. So, I mean, just in terms of predictions, do you think that actually Democrats could have a much better result in the midterms than people are saying?
Sure, I think it's possible. Our elections are quite erratic. They often do not match predictions. Unfortunately, almost always when that happens, it's to the benefit of the GOP, not to the Democrats. So I'm not terribly optimistic. In terms of what the Democrats can do, I certainly hope there's an election integrity budget. There should be. It should just be something that Jamie Harrison, for the head of the DNC, has apportioned out. Because, for example, on these switch voter registrations, we need to get a handle on that. And I know that Senator Taddeo has asked the Justice Department, but they've kind of got their hands full right now. So, and we have some state AGs, but they're Republicans looking into it. But we need some financial muscle to look into these things. So I would certainly look into the changed voter registrations. You also have Scott Pressler has been, I don't know that he's involved with this same group that switched the voter registrations. I think maybe not. But we have suddenly Republicans surpassing Democrats in other places as well, making just these enormous gains. And it may be that they're just doing a really good job getting out registering voters. That is possible. But in Florida, certainly there's some hanky-panky. there's some shenanigans going on, fraud going on. And I think the DNC has a role to play in that. I think they need to just get back on their game a little bit on this election integrity stuff. With the attacks on vote by mail, there will be more pressure than ever on in-person voting systems. And oftentimes those break down, which can happen either deliberately or accidentally. But in either case, it often seems to be to the detriment of Democrats in these sort of large urban areas tend to have the equipment breakdowns. And electronic poll books in particular are prone to breaking down. Yet you have Republican secretaries of states in places like Georgia, Brian Kemp, fighting in court to not have backup paper poll books on election day, which makes no sense. So I think that is just sort of it should be a no-brainer, something that the Democrats focus on. And I was glad to see that there is an emphasis. There was a workshop that the DNC was putting on messaging on social media. I was glad to see they're paying some attention to that. I didn't attend, but since I think the DNC has been so poor on this subject, I don't know. I'm not too optimistic about that.
It's a shame. I don't know if you saw that Barack Obama, the former president, made a speech at Stanford on Thursday. That was. I
heard about that. Yep.
Yeah, and it's definitely worth a listen. I sat through the whole hour, and he talked about social media in the main, misinformation and election integrity going forward. He also described the time he was shown a video of himself saying stuff, except it wasn't him, and he hadn't said that, and it was AI. And he said that this was his biggest concern, is that, using technology now, you're basically able to put out a message to voters that is actually not the message that a political party is hoping to communicate, or certainly the other side is able to do that. And that is going, misinformation is not just words on a page, but it's also pictures now, and video, and people denying that they ever said anything. This is, it's almost like we get what we deserve because we've created these technologies, and we, and even when it comes to election interference, you talking about wireless modems in polling places. I mean, this is the technology that we've created for ourselves. So in a way, we've opened a wormhole on our own integrity, haven't we?
Yes and no. I mean, certainly our children don't deserve it, and I wouldn't say that we deserve what the Republicans are doing. No, I don't think so. I mean, what I would say is I think that we need a lot more emphasis on what propaganda literacy, so that people know what the different types are and know how to detect them. And, if I were running a news agency, I would have, or if I had a podcast, I would have people on a regular basis who are experts in propaganda and talk about the different techniques. Like, this is what cherry picking means. This is, what not a I used to do a lot of threads on propaganda. Certainly the fire hose of falsehoods method to recognize it, having people who aren't really journalists in the sense that they have no good faith interest in the truth. That's what I would say someone is not a journalist, if that's what they are. And that would be someone like Jack Posobiec, but you dress them up in a suit and you put them on a news show that looks like a real news show and you call it news. That's very similar to the white coat strategy that was used by the cigarette companies. It's also similar to what Sidney Powell did. And I think just educating the public to recognize these techniques is really important. And it can't just be one show, though. It has to be done on a regular basis. And for God's sakes, holding the Republicans' feet to the fire on the switched voter registrations. Why that should be front and center. You have been all over about election integrity. What is going on with these switched voter registrations? What are you doing to investigate it? How are we going to get to the bottom of it? And it's an organization, by the way, called Florida First, which is funded by America First, which is tied to the Trump campaign.
Yeah.
I mean, it
all goes back to the guy at the top, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. I feel and I sense your despair, and you've sighed 3 times during this conversation, and I feel you, I really do. But we need people like you to highlight, and your Twitter is very active, and you're very eloquent there, highlighting this. And Obama said in his speech that, educating young people to spot the difference between something that is true and something that is not true, to learn to fact check, even in school, is really where this needs to start. And I completely get that. Jennifer, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate your expertise.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. And I do want to say I have some despair, but I wouldn't have come on the show if I felt the situation was hopeless, and I wouldn't continue to use my Twitter feed if I thought the situation was hopeless. It's just, we do have our backs against the wall, and it's all hands on deck. So thank you very much for inviting me on.
My thanks to Jennifer Cohn. Don't forget to subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast. And also the 5-Minute News Daily podcast, which drops every morning so you can listen whilst you make your morning coffee. And leave an iTunes review, but only if you like the show. I'm Anthony Davis. Join me next Sunday morning with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5-Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.